Hi, I'm Leslie Pielack. I'm the Birmingham Museum director, and tonight I'm going to be sharing some of the recent findings we at the museum have uncovered about Black families in our history. Our mission here at the museum is to tell Birmingham's story, and that really means telling the whole story as we learn more about the diverse nature of our history and population. We have a lot to share. Tonight, we're going to be focusing specifically on the Black families of early Birmingham. Our highlights are going to include pioneer and early Black residents of Oakland County and the vicinity, Birmingham's abolitionists, the Underground Railroad in Oakland County, freedom seekers in Birmingham, people who were Black but also Native American, and finally, a little bit about being Black in Birmingham in the early 20th century. As with all historical institutions, we have a whole team of people who help us with finding out new information about our history. And we want to credit some of them before we go any further with this program. First, we have a number of volunteer researchers that help us in uncovering information on documents, early newspapers, etc. And especially we want to thank George Getchman of the Friends of the Birmingham Museum and also Jackie Pat of the Friends for their work to help us open up this avenue of research and find out even more about our Black history. Another significant person is Donna Casticelli, who works at the Birmingham Museum and who has done quite a bit of amazing research and added vastly to what we understand about early Black residents here. The Jackson Flagg family, these are the descendants of some of Birmingham's early Black residents who have very generously shared their family stories and, most importantly, for our uses tonight, their family photos, which you will see. We also want to thank the Bloomfield Township Library because the eccentric newspaper archives there are accessible to everyone, including people like us who need to go back in and double check references within the newspapers. And that's a really important resource. The Royal Oak Historical Museum for their assistance in providing information. And we have some additional articles on all of this material on our website, and that's mentioned there. It would be difficult to talk about the Black history of Birmingham without starting with some context. We need to sometimes see how local events and people fit into the bigger picture. So let me just cover some essential context before we talk about our early Black history here. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that Michigan Territory had certain legalities in place regarding the issue of slavery that bear on the people who came here and why they came, why they stayed, or why they didn't stay. For example, just as a point of reference, in 1805 in Detroit, official records show that there were 15 African Americans in residence in this town of Detroit. I'm saying town because in 1805, Detroit was hardly a city. It was really an outpost town in the vast territory that was not even completely mapped out. Keep in mind that in 1805, we had just recently succeeded in the Revolutionary War to break away from Britain, and this was all wilderness here. We did have, as I mentioned, outposts at Detroit, a trading center at Detroit, one up at Mackinac, and there was one that was forming in Chicago, and that was pretty much it. There were no towns, no settlements whatsoever in the interior of Michigan. At that time, though, when Michigan Territory was carved out of the larger Northwest Territory, that was in 1805, the federal government sent to the new territorial capital of Detroit 3 justices and began to dispense U.S. Legal justice. So very interestingly, in Detroit, a woman whose name was Elizabeth, or she went by Lizette, Dennison Forth, was brought to the territorial judge, the first suit in U.S. history of an enslaved person suing for their freedom. And the justice she brought it before was Augustus Woodward, who the Woodward Avenue is named for, and who made a huge difference in early territorial justice and law. Justice Woodward found in favor of the family who was the slaveholder of Lizette and her siblings because of a technicality in the law. And her slaveholder was actually British, not American. And that played into why, even though Woodward was an anti-slavery supporter, he could not find in her favor because of the law. But just 1 month later, he did use new case law to establish an opinion in a finding called the Pattinson Opinion of 1807, in which he was able to establish that slavery would be outlawed in the territory of Michigan. When that happened, it solidified abolitionists in Detroit and gave them, new support. So Detroit became a very large center, even though it was a small town, for the abolition movement in Michigan, and that became important later for Birmingham. Another important part of the context moving forward in time was the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. For those of you who are not familiar, at the time there were free states and slave states in the country, and so there were tensions between the free and the slave states, and they tended to be, north and south. Which I'm sure you're aware, but just as a point of reference, along the border between the slaveholding and the non-slaveholding states, there was all kinds of tension because of the tendency for enslaved people to hurry away from their enslavement and get into the free states was increasing all the time. In fact, Michigan, because it was a free territory, because it had been established that way by Augustus Woodward, was a destination that many enslaved people hoped to reach. And they increasingly were escaping enslavement and hurrying north as best they could. When tensions mounted between slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states, the result was the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In fact, a lot of the tension had arisen specifically between Indiana and Michigan because freedom seekers were escaping Tennessee, Kentucky, places further south, going through Indiana and getting to Michigan. But Indiana had all sorts of people who were opposed to the free state idea. And so often those enslaved people would be recaptured and sent back. Once they got to Michigan, they were okay, except with the Fugitive Slave Act, that permitted people to go across Michigan the border here on Michigan soil, recapture people and return them. So that changed things a little. And because federal law permitted that, the Underground Railroad and the sophisticated system that began to expand to move these people secretly became more and more sophisticated. Like I said, there was a need for a workaround because this law meant that if you could keep freedom seekers hidden, they would be able to get all the way to Canada, where in fact, as soon as they stepped on Canadian soil, they would be freed based on Canada law. Another significant context issue was the Civil War, which was declared in 1861. Civil War was ended in 1865. That changed a lot of things about who was doing what, where, and during that 4+ year period, a lot of things came to a halt or were very difficult in terms of abolition. The Emancipation Proclamation is another thing to keep in mind. President Lincoln announced his intentions in September of 1862, but he didn't really sign the proclamation until January of 1863. So he telegraphed his intention to sign it, which allowed people to make preparations, in essence, for what that would mean. Sorry, that went backward, pardon me. Okay, so that's some of the context. So let's get to some of the families here. The earliest family that we have know about, anyway, in the vicinity was the Harris family. This was Hamlet Harris and his wife, Jane Harris. And they came to the Michigan Territory before it was a state in 1833. And these were free people of color who migrated from Georgia and purchased land in the Royal Oak area. And in that inset map, if you see in the very middle, you see Hamlet, and then there's a capital H. That represents the 80 acres that Hamlet Harris actually bought, and we have record of, in 1839. Today, it's on West Catawba and Royal Oak. The Harrises came with 7 children, and they had 3 more after they got to Oakland County. Another thing to keep in mind, although Hamlet was free always, he had purchased his wife, Jane, out of enslavement. So she was enslaved at one time. So that was the first generation. And let me just also explain, going back for a moment, I have tried to highlight the important generations and certain couples within those generations and certain individuals by highlighting them with the gold color, because they're going to come up again later. So that's one way for me to have organized genealogy for the purposes of this presentation. So hopefully that will be of help to you. So the next generation of the Harrises were Abraham Harris Sr. and his wife, Athena, or she went by Martha White. Now, Abraham and Martha had married in Georgia. They were adults when the family came here. But their story is very important for what happened later in Birmingham, because Martha White, who had been enslaved, was the mother of a woman named Julia. And Julia Ann Blevins becomes important later for people who lived in Birmingham and what happened to them. But just for this slide, to keep in mind that Abe Harris and Martha White had relocated here and had a very large family that was an important part of this settlement in the farm area of Royal Oak. Now, they had 5 children together, and their youngest, which would represent actually the 3rd generation of Harrises, was also named Abraham and went by Abel. So we're using the term junior, although he did not, just to distinguish the 2, senior and junior. Another thing I want to point out about Abe and Martha White is that I made a mistake just now, and I said they were married in Georgia. That's not true, actually. Abe came here as an adult, that's true, but he married Martha White here in Detroit in 1853. I made a mistake on that detail. But I want to call it out because that was a couple of years after the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law. And because she had been formerly enslaved, we don't know if she was here as an escapee or if she had been freed in some way and was a free woman when he married her. We don't really know if when he married her that, that created a free status for her at the time. But it's important, I think, to look at her heritage and her background, what she brought with her, besides the fact that she had a child by her previous slaveholder, and that child being Julia Ann Blevins. So now I'm going to leave briefly the Harris family and go to the Farmer family. The Farmer family, the first generation of farmers, also were free people who came to the Wayne County area. They came a little bit later than the Harrises. So Abraham Farmer and Mary Miller were the couple that began this story. They were married in Delaware, and Abraham died in Delaware around 1830, and Mary continued to raise their children with family members there until the 1850s, middle 1850s, when they left Delaware to come to Michigan. Again, I'm pointing out that it's the middle 1850s because the Fugitive Slave Law actually had an impact on them in Delaware. They had always been free people. They were part of a group known as the Delaware Moors, which I will tell you more about in a few minutes. And the problem was that with increasing tensions in between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, even free people in Delaware who had been free for many generations felt pressure and the need to migrate away from their traditional home in Delaware. The Millers came with other Delaware Moor families to Michigan at a time when it was a migration-friendly area, especially for people of color. So when Mary came here, she came with her adult children, Henry, John, Nancy, and important for our story, Josiah, who went by Joseph. So Joseph Farmer comes into the next generation story. So the Farmer family's second generation consisted of Joseph Farmer and his wife, Elizabeth Miller. Now, they actually married here in Michigan. I'm sorry, I got that wrong again. It's right in front of me here. They actually married in Delaware. That's right. And they came to Michigan in late 1855 and early 1856. They had like two sets of children. They had a group of children in Delaware who were older by the time they migrated here. And then they had a whole second group of children once they got here. And so I think to think about what the family went through, their first life was in an area where they were in their traditional homeland, around many people that they were interrelated with in a small community of farmers. And they picked up everything and moved here with a couple other families in tow, but they basically were making a new start. And in the second group of their children who were born here, a significant person again was named Joseph. Now, his father's name was Josiah, but he went by Joseph. But the son, Joseph, who we're calling Junior, is a part of this story. And so is his sister, Elizabeth, who went by Abby. So these are children who were growing up in the Free Territory of Michigan, but surrounded by the pressure of the Fugitive Slave Act and people of color who were constantly moving through the area via the Underground Railroad. More about the Farmer family, more about this now third generation. Joseph Farmer Jr. married Clara Blevins Taylor. I will explain a little more about that in a moment. They married in Birmingham in 1898. So this is after the war. The war is now over. Some of these younger generation, mixed race and African-American migration-based folks were able to purchase land, settle down, and Birmingham became a place that some of these families came to, the Farmer family in particular. When Joseph and Clara were married, they stayed in Birmingham. They had 4 children altogether. The first 3, Burley, Florence, and Alta May, were born in Birmingham. And we have some interesting documents that Joseph Farmer lived on land that is right behind the museum in an area that at the time was farm area. And he had built a house back there on a street that was actually Dewey Street. This is our Dewey Street now, and I'll show you a map in a moment. But we discovered a fire insurance policy that he took out on the house, and it was a substantial house for the period. It was a very comfortable and well-appointed house. It was a story and a half, and it was fairly large, and he had quite a bit of furnishings that he insured. And we don't even know for sure what his occupation was, but he definitely was able to have a nice home and furnish it well. Unfortunately, Altamay died in childhood, and shortly after that, the farmers, Joseph and Clara Blevins Taylor farmer, moved up to the Midland area. They had one more child there, and then Joseph died, and Clara's life continued there, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. Okay, so we were just here at the farmer family, and so we're going forward to another family in the Royal Oak area that has an interesting history that bears on Birmingham. The reason that these families were in actually what we would think of as different towns right now is because boundaries didn't mean the same thing then as they do now. So the difference between Royal Oak and Birmingham is, there's a governmental difference, there are differences in roads and funding and, all of that. But back then it was just Oakland County, and it was farms, and there were settlements and towns, but there was no real understanding that there were firm boundaries between them. So people often communicated and traveled and did their business in whatever the local town was, wherever they were. Oh, and so what I wanted to say about this is the Caissons were also free people of color. And Daniel Caisson, also shown on some documents as Caisson, married a woman named Matilda Dozier, who also is sometimes called Matilda Stull. And Matilda was also formerly enslaved. And they were married in Michigan in 1860. So we don't know if she also had come here as a fugitive from enslavement, if she was a freedom seeker and that was how they met, or if she had been freed and came here. But her first life in enslavement bears on Birmingham's story also. Caisson was a free Black man. He came to Royal Oak before 1850, and he purchased a parcel north of town. And in the little inset map there, if you look right in the middle, you might see the name S. Finn, 22 acres, and then 1, 2, 3 names below that is D. Caisson, and that represents the property owned by Daniel Caisson at the time. He actually had a first wife and a number of children, and he was a little older in age when he married Matilda. So Matilda's story, we have some gaps in it, but we know that she was born into slavery in Kentucky. She appears on the Michigan census in 1860 after they were married. And we also know from a later obituary that she was separated from her daughter born in enslavement, named Eliza Dozier. We don't know at this point if Eliza Dozier was the child of a slaveholder or not, but we do know that Matilda and Eliza were separated in the 1830s. And after the Civil War ended, Eliza came to Michigan seeking her mother. And that is where the story again comes to Birmingham. So now we're talking about the Taylor family, which is basically the second generation of the Kaysen story. George Taylor's story is a well-documented example of what it was like to be enslaved in Kentucky, to be publicly whipped, and to determine that even with all of the difficulties, the only course you had was to flee to the north. He came to Michigan via the Underground Railroad, and he was in the Birmingham area, somehow met Eliza, who had come here seeking her mother, and the two were married in 1869. As I mentioned, that's after the war. George had been here for a while. So another significant thing that happened between George and Eliza is that although they didn't have any children of their own, and they were a little older when they were married in 1869, they did adopt Clara Blevins Taylor in 1876, shortly after her birth. Now, a minute ago, I was telling you the story of Joseph Farmer, who married Clara Blevins Taylor in 1898. So this is the story of where Clara came from and how she and Joseph came together. Clara's biological mother, I've already mentioned, was Julia Ann Blevins. Julia Ann Blevins was the child of Martha White and a man identified only as, at this point, as slaveholder Blevins. We haven't been able to determine any more about that slaveholding family, but it was also in Kentucky. So how Julia Blevins came to Oakland County and when she seems to have come here as a child, how she got here and was reunited with her mother, Martha, is unclear, but she did go to live with them. Some point after that, Julia herself had a child. We also don't know if she was married or if this was, a liaison that didn't involve marriage. She was an unmarried mother, but she seems to have been a single mother at the time the child was born, and the child was Clara Blevins, and the Taylors adopted her, and she grew up in Birmingham. So coming back then, again, circling back to Joseph Farmer and Clara Blevins Taylor, again, they were married in Birmingham in 1898, long after the war, really almost to the turn of the 20th century. As I mentioned, they lived on Dewey Street. So here's the map I'd referenced. In the inset map, you can see a red circle. That represents the location of the Farmer home. That home is not there anymore. In fact, the subdivision has a different configuration now in terms of the lots and so forth. But that gives you an idea of where they lived, very close to the village of Birmingham at the time. Now, also, I mentioned that they had 3 children. Burley is shown here, a photo of him as an adult. He became quite an accomplished violinist in the early 20th century. Actually, let me go back to say this. The Farmers moved to the Midland area, and their 4th child was born there. That's where Burley grew up. That's where Florence grew up. And that's where their story goes after they left Birmingham. They left Birmingham in the early, I think it was around 1908. So the story of the Farmers, that is to say Joseph and Clara Blevins Taylor, is also connected to the story of the Harrises, who I told you about already. Abe Harris married Abby Farmer. Abby Farmer was Joseph Farmer's sister. They also married in Birmingham, and they came to Birmingham not just to be married, but they also lived here. And so the late 19th century in Birmingham, there were at least 2 families of color living in town. And then shortly afterward, a third. So we know the Taylors lived here, the farmers, and the Harrises during that period. Unfortunately, Abby died young, and the couple had only one child. And here is her photo. Lula Mae Harris was born in 1899. She was born in Birmingham, probably at home, and she grew up here, attended school here. And the Harris family, this branch of the Harris family, continued to live in Birmingham for almost 100 years. This is the next generation. This is Lula Mae as an adult, and her husband, James Jackson. That should be Lucius James Jackson. Lucius Jackson did not grow up in Birmingham. He actually came to the Detroit area to work in the auto industry, but he did attend Tuskegee Institute and got his diploma there. He was a very capable person. The Jacksons settled in Birmingham. They moved into the house that Lula Mae's father lived in, and it was on Lincoln. And the family continued to live here until the late 20th century, as I just mentioned. They had several children, and Lucius E. in particular, we can tell more story about because we have some records of his attendance in Birmingham schools and some of the things that Lucius E. accomplished. I will be telling you more about the 20th century Black families of Birmingham in a little while. So I'm going back again in time. And this is how history often works. Because it's one whole big picture, but we can't take it in. It's too big. We have to tell little versions of it. So this is the abolition story of Birmingham. So I'm going back in time again to talk about Michigan's anti-slavery movement. This is a way of explaining what the climate and the context was like in Birmingham when these Black families settled and lived here. So early on in the Michigan anti-slavery movement, the key areas were also some of the most populated areas in early Michigan. This is before Michigan was even a state. So we have Detroit, of course, Ann Arbor, which developed later, Pontiac, which also was a significant town in the early territory, and Birmingham. Birmingham featured into early abolition in an unexpected way, even though it was just a small town. So Birmingham's abolitionists and who they associated with. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to abolitionism, at least at this point, it often went hand in hand with temperance activism. That is to say, the avoidance of alcohol for all of its negative impacts on family and medical problems. And so the temperance movement was also something that basically sprang out of New England and some of in New York. And a lot of those migrating families and settlers came to Michigan early on to settle Michigan. So they brought those values with them. So one of the early settlers of Birmingham was Elijah Fish, and he was here by 1836. And this is a white European-based family, but he was a very active person in terms of his church, and he was very opposed to slavery. And he became an activist in the abolition movement. Another man locally who may have been involved is Roswell T. Merrill. You'll note that there is a street in Birmingham called Merrill Street. It's named after the Merrill family. And it's not clear because if you were an abolitionist at the time, you really didn't usually advertise it openly. A lot of times you conducted your business privately. And Roswell Merrill made his large building in downtown Birmingham available for public gatherings and public lectures on anti-slavery topics. And so that's how he may have been a type of an abolition abolitionist. But the activist abolitionists included Elijah Fish, and then in Pontiac, George Wisner. Pontiac was, a half a day's travel by horse, but it was basically the closest and the largest. It was the county seat, and at the time, Birmingham was really just a small town, and so there was a lot of communication between the two. And another area nearby, Troy, was dominated by settler Stephen V.R. Trowbridge, and the senior, who also had very strong leanings toward the New England values, and we think that he could have also been an abolitionist. Fish stood out, though, because Elijah Fish actually brought lecturers here to the little town of Birmingham early on who were nationally known abolitionists and African Americans. One of them was Henry Bibb, who was a formerly enslaved man who became very famous and relocated to Michigan, and then also over to Canada to be near Michigan, but in Canada proper. And he published The Voice of the Fugitive, which was a free, liberty-seeking paper for by and about freedom seekers and their needs. And many notices in his paper include references to early abolitionists and their attempts to organize fundraising. And that's where we got lots of information actually about Elijah Fish. So Henry Bibb was brought to Birmingham by Fish, and so the public could gather from all over Oakland County in Birmingham to hear him speak. And Fish also brought William Cooper Nell, who was he was a free man of color who was an abolitionist and national lecturer in the latter part of the 1850s. So abolition was an important part of the values of the settlers of early Michigan and the Oakland County area. And so how did the Underground Railroad figure into Oakland County? A couple of things to point out about the Underground Railroad is it was a network. It was a large network. It depended on communication between long distances between not just locations in Michigan with each other, but locations between Michigan and border states and even further south in order to be effective. The Quakers were responsible for a lot of the establishment of the most significant routes of the Underground Railroad. Because of their strong anti-slavery and temperance views, they early on developed methods of helping assist enslaved people who left enslavement so that they could get to free soil. So there are things to know about the Underground Railroad before and after 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted. First of all, there were key stops along the Underground Railroad to get people from the South up to the Michigan border for its free status, but also further on after the Slave Act, they needed to get all the way to Canada to become safely free. And the stops along the way were usually farmsteads, sometimes clustered nearby each other, sometimes all by themselves. And there were all kinds of coded signals that were used, et cetera, to help people know where to find the routes and to the next farmstead that would hide them, and how to get from place to place. These places, there were sort of significant towns that were very well established. And they were in the Western Michigan, they were Niles and Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, and Jackson. And then as you got a little closer to Detroit, it was Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. And then in Western Wayne County, it was Nankin Township, which is now Westland. And by the way, the farmer family that I told you about had property and were farmers in Nankin Township. Further into Oakland County, we have Farmington, which was also a Quaker settlement that figured very centrally in moving people through Oakland County from the south end of the county. And then Southfield, definitely after 1853, probably before that. After 1853, Reverend JST Milligan was very significant in the Underground Railroad movement in the Southfield area and very verbal about it. But probably before then, there were networks established. Pontiac also was important, especially later on when the activities of the bounty hunters were ramped up, and they would come into Michigan because the law let them to actually raid farmsteads that they knew were associated with the Underground Railroad, to patrol the streets of Detroit, looking for African Americans who might be their target. And so that made not going to Detroit a little bit safer after a while. And Pontiac became an important route on the way to Lapeer and to Port Huron. Once in Port Huron, then people were able to get across the river, various means to go to the Sarnia area. And as I mentioned, once they got to Canadian soil, they were free. Now, the Reverend JST Milligan has been established as a member of the Underground Railroad. He was an active station master. He had a farmstead in the Southfield area. It was Southfield, but it was 12 and Evergreen. And as many of you know, that's basically the outskirts of Birmingham. It was then, and it is now. He also had farming neighbors nearby who were available to bring in workers, formerly enslaved people, freedom seekers who perhaps went to Canada, could not find work there, and came back. And Milligan would help them find work nearby. And often that would be at these farms. And in some cases, it was the adjacent farm over. And this is where the connection to George Taylor, the first African-American who bought property in Birmingham. He's the man who married Eliza Dozier and after the war, and they adopted Clara Blevins. So that's how we think George and Reverend Milligan were connected. We don't know if Reverend Milligan helped him before he became free in Canada, but we know he did after George came back. A little bit more then about Pontiac, just up the road, as I said, from Birmingham. It was a large agricultural community, so you had a lot of activity, a lot of commercial activity. For the time, people would bring in their crops and produce from the outlying farms and bring them into Pontiac. And there were places in Pontiac that served as like depots, and there were liveries, and you would process your products and ship them to Detroit, where they were being sold, your agricultural products. And so that also meant that there was a route, if needed, to get freedom seekers from Pontiac down to Detroit via these wagons, which I think was a significant way that people did get moved to Detroit, even though Detroit was dangerous. But definitely by the later 1850s, freedom seekers were avoiding Detroit and Windsor in favor of Lapeer and Port Huron and Sarnia. And here is an article in the Pontiac Gazette from 1859. So this is before the war. That's an interesting time to remember. And it describes an Underground Railroad actively taking people through the city and on to Canada. Significantly for me, I always understood that the term Underground Railroad was applied later on in the 19th century by historians who were looking back at these activities. This is interesting to me because it was using the term UGR, Underground Railroad, in 1859. Here's a map that indicates where some of the stops on the Underground Railroad were in Michigan. And if you zero in, you can see from west, it goes all the way through Jackson, Ann Arbor, toward Northville, Farmington, and then Birmingham, Pontiac, Rochester, Romeo, and over to Lake St. Clair, and then also further north to Port Huron. So that gives you an idea of the pathways being used. So Birmingham shows up here as an important stop. And maybe part of the reason why is that there was a train between Detroit and Pontiac with a stop in Birmingham. There was also an important road between Detroit and Birmingham, between Detroit and Pontiac, that went through Birmingham. That was now called Woodward Avenue, and it was the Saginaw Road. So there was a significant train presence, and there also was a planked road. Planking was an activity that was done to this road after 1854. Remember the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. So now you have a planked road, which is a much more predictable surface that you can move wagons across. The planked road was used by farmers, even in the middle of the night, to move produce down to Detroit. So it would have been an option if you were going to move people secretly in wagons, which was commonly done. You might be able to get them to Detroit. You certainly could take them up to Pontiac, and they could go from there further north to safety in Canada. So now we want to talk a little bit more about the Taylors and George's status as a freedom seeker, and how he came to Birmingham, and how the Taylors made a difference in Birmingham, why they stand out. I mentioned that George had escaped from Kentucky, and his escape was detailed in an 1898 article. This was an interview of George in which he talked about what happened when he left Kentucky, why he left, and what his harrowing journey was like trying to get to Michigan. As I also indicated, we're not sure about before he got to Canada, but we know that after he came back from Canada, George was helped by JST Milligan, and he and Eliza helped the Milligan family for many years, and they seem to be very close. Also, to repeat, Eliza came to Oakland County after the war, seeking her mother, Matilda Kaysen, who was in Royal Oak. Eliza and her mother had been separated because they were sold to different slaveholders when Eliza was just a child. So her ability to find her mother may be because they were in some kind of communication, or maybe it was happenstance. It's not clear how they kept in touch or how Eliza knew to come to Michigan to seek her mother, but she did. She found her, they were reunited, and sometime shortly thereafter, she and George were married. Because of this very well-established documentation of the Underground Railroad connections to Birmingham, the museum has headed up the effort to seek designation by the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. And that actually allows the individual sites, sometimes their homes, sometimes their stations on farms, or other significant locations throughout the nation where the Underground Railroad activities occurred. It allows those places to be formally designated if the documentation is sufficient. And so we expect that we will be able to get that designation, and it will actually reside in Greenwood Cemetery because Elijah Fish is buried there, and also George and Eliza Taylor are buried there. Although the Taylors are buried there, they did not receive grave markers when they died in 1901 and 1902. So in 2020 and 2021, the museum and the Friends of the Birmingham Museum and the Piety Hill chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution all came together to raise funds, and through crowdsourced funding, we were able to raise more than enough funds to erect a marker for the Taylors in Greenwood, which we hope to do this year. Now, there's going to be much more about freedom seekers in Birmingham, Birmingham and the Underground Railroad, Elijah Fish and the Taylors and their stories in much more detail, being presented on June 2nd at the library here by Donna Cassicelli from the Birmingham Museum. She's going to get into a lot more details about George's flight, what he went through, also more about other Underground Railroad activities in our area, and certainly more about an update on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom status, and more about Elijah Fish. That will be a free presentation at the Baldwin Library. So before we leave the topic of Black families of early Birmingham and the early history, we want to also talk about this concept of being Black, but also being Native American. I started off talking about the Harris family, and they were one of the earliest families to come to Royal Oak, and they were a free family of color. Now, Hamlet had, according to family history, purchased his wife, Jane, out of enslavement. And Jane was biracial. She was African American and Native American. But Hamlet actually was full Cherokee in Georgia. He came from the local Cherokee tribe. And when they came to Michigan, he took the name Harris from his wife, stating, at least according to the family lore, that his Cherokee name was too difficult to pronounce. But what he also did was take on the identity of being Black. It's interesting to note that although we always are concerned about the fact that Black people at that time were without so many rights and that their lives were so difficult because of that, actually it was even worse for Native Americans, because free Blacks at least were considered citizens. They couldn't vote, but they at least could hold property and so forth. Native Americans were not even considered citizens of the US. They were considered foreigners. And so they had even fewer rights. Now, whether this is why Hamlet Harris chose to identify as Black, or whether he had other reasons, or whether it really didn't matter, he was coming to a wilderness with his family and he was going to farm, and it was what it was. It's not really clear, but he was identified this way throughout his life. And when African Americans won the vote, African American men anyway, after the Civil War, Hamlet Harris was still alive, and he is recorded as weeping with joy that he could now vote. Something to keep in mind. I had talked a little bit about when the farmers came to Wayne County, to Nankin Township, they were coming from Delaware, and that they were part of the Delaware Moor community. So what is that? Well, interestingly, the Delaware Moor community were free people of color in a very close-knit community. They had heritage that extended back to colonial times. Their heritage was multiracial. It was African American, Native American, and European. And so they formulated these communities, which were kind of set apart from the local towns and villages in along the eastern seaboard in early Delaware. And they farmed, and they were self-sustaining, and they were a fairly sizable communities that sort of formulated their own culture, and intermarried heavily. So the families in that you can research back in the early 1800s through at least the 1850s, 60s, and 70s in Delaware were often intermarrying. They were located in the same areas of Sussex County and Kent counties in Delaware. And it really wasn't until the latter part of the 19th century that most of the families kind of dwindled away, although people now will still be able to trace back their so-called Delaware Moor heritage. So the Delaware Moors are significant too in our story, because when they did migrate to Michigan, they came in the late 1850s, and there were numerous families that came together kind of en masse. In this inset map, for example, you can see J. Farmer, 30 acres, right smack dab in the middle. That's Josiah Farmer. And you can see adjacent to him is the Proctor Farm, kitty corner, 80 acres. And you can see the Dean Farm, 15 acres nearby. Well, the Deans and the Proctors were also Delaware Moors who had moved here at the same time, and the families continued to intermarry. Later on, after the late part of the 19th century, many of these families, including the farmers from Birmingham by that point, moved up to the Midland area where they could continue to farm, they could continue to form their community in the ways and the values that mattered to them, a little bit apart from the big cities. And that seems to be the kind of the end point where the Delaware Moors of Michigan ended up in general. And there still are families there that relate, that are related to the Proctors, the Deans, and some of the others. So for my final few slides, I wanted to talk about what we know about being Black in Birmingham in the early 20th century. We, meaning museum researchers, and a little bit that we understand from the Jackson Flagg family who grew up here, and some of the documents that we've been able to uncover. So I wanted to share a little bit with you about that. Just as a reminder again, so Lulu Mae Harris was the only child of Abe and Abby Harris. She was born in 1899 in Birmingham. She married Lucius James Jackson. Lucius had earned his diploma from Tuskegee in 1915, and that was the time the auto industry just started booming in Detroit. So many people came to Detroit as part of that growing industry, and that included Lucius Jackson. He worked for the auto industry at the time. The family settled in Birmingham. They lived in the house that Abe Harris owned on Lincoln. And later on in life, Lucius served as a bank security guard. So the family always was here in Birmingham. As I mentioned, they lived on Lincoln west of Woodward. The house is not there anymore. It was demolished in the 80s or 90s for new construction. But they represent a multi-generational Black family that was in Birmingham almost 100 years. When Abe Harris died, he never remarried after his young wife, Abby, died. In 1950, he was also buried in Greenwood next to Abby Farmer Harris. And he had been well known in town during the time that Birmingham was making the transition from a village to a city to a much bigger city and quite a wealthy city. Their son, that is Lulu Mae and Lucius's son, also named Lucius E. Jackson, attended Birmingham High. And this is his senior photo here. And then moved on to, I think he had a military career and moved out of state. But Lulu May and Lucius continued to live here. But when they died, they actually were buried not here in Greenwood, but in Royal Oak near the Harrises, suggesting that they had maintained close ties with the Harrises all along, even though they lived in Birmingham. Some more about being Black in Birmingham. The Harris family, of course, being the most significant and during the 20th century, the longest lived Birmingham family, featured in some of the local articles. For example, in 1936, there were articles written for Birmingham's local eccentric newspaper by Minnie Seltzer. Minnie Seltzer did a regular column where she talked about Birmingham history, and the column was published in the Eccentric. In this issue, on January 30th of 1936, she told the story of the Harris family in Birmingham, and she got it all wrong. And not only was it erroneous, but it was full of bias and prejudice. And it's pretty, uncomfortable to read it these days, but we do include it because it's part of the history here. After he read the article, Abe Harris, that's him as an older man when he lived on Lincoln, wrote a scathing retort that was published by the Eccentric, which we also have an inset there. And I have a quote from it. In part, what he said was, quote, "John Harris was never called, quote, Darky Harris. Why Mrs. Seltzer would write such an article is not only an insult to me, but a disgrace to the Eccentric." So that gives you an idea of some of the tone of some of the people in Birmingham. It wasn't all acceptance and community involvement. Another example of what a lot of people would think of as kind of benign, but very clear bias operating is this inset that talks about a colored preacher coming to St. James's next Sunday. Not that a preacher is coming from another church, but that it seemed important to identify this preacher by his racial status. Again, something that we kind of shudder at, but it helps give you that sense of what the 1920s and 30s were like in Birmingham. There's another interesting story that goes with this. In 1949, a Latino Hispanic artist, a mural artist named Carlos Lopez, was under contract to paint a mural in the new post office in Birmingham. And the post office building still exists, but it's in private hands at this time. And the mural still exists also, just so you know. So Lopez was a muralist who was known for his early depictions of African Americans and racial ambiguity in a lot of his murals of the period. This is before the civil rights era was in full swing. So this is the 1940s, just post World War II. This design that he came up with was based on a pioneer barbecue that he had heard about, that one of the residents of Birmingham, Fanny Fish, actually, who was Elijah Fish's daughter, had remembrance of this pioneer gathering toward the late 19th century, where all the old pioneers of Birmingham, of Oakland County that had settled, that were, quite advanced in age, came together to celebrate. So they used this as the theme for the mural. So he designed the mural, and the panel that had hired him approved it in advance because it was all federal funds being paid to him. So they had to go through all these steps. After the mural was painted, though, there was a lot of local criticism from a small segment of the Birmingham community when they went into the post office to see the mural for the first time. They were complaining in the eccentric that they thought that the figures didn't look like Americans. That there were people in the picnic that had, and this is a historic language warning, features of the Negroid type that they were opposed to. And this is in 1942. There's something wrong there. I think that's supposed to be 1949 because the post office mural was done later in the 40s. But I think this is part of that very narrow-minded and very frightened, kind of predominant feeling about communism and liberals and all of that that worried a lot of people who had established roots in a community. And so the idea of diversity was a little frightening to them. And so I think that's where this criticism came from. And I thought I would show you part of the inset of this mural that was the most criticized. And if you want to know more about that mural and more about discrimination in Birmingham, stop by the museum, and we will be including information about that in our exhibit this year. That's not all. I mean, and it isn't everything either. There were also white people in Birmingham who were outraged by treatment of African Americans and did something about it. Here's an example, and this is in 1949 when there was an incident in a Birmingham restaurant when some women who worked together went to have lunch in this restaurant, and one of them being African American, the restaurant owner suggested she eat back in the kitchen instead of in the dining room. And her companions were so outraged that they filed a civil rights violation and won. So the restaurant owner was in fact fined after the fact. It's not a very big fine, but it's a very big point to be made. Another notation here is one of the Detroit papers, we don't know for sure if it was the Free Press or the News, published an article that was about the Birmingham voting for open housing. In 1955, the Birmingham community voted for open housing, which was a very liberal move to make. And so they have this article where they interviewed Lucius Jackson and Lula Mae Jackson about it. So here's my final slide, really. So what about today? What's our situation today about the Black history of Birmingham? Well, I can only sum up with this comment. Recently, somebody said to me, who lives in Birmingham, I didn't know Birmingham had a Black history. So we at the museum would like to make some changes there and help share the information that not only is there a Black history, but there's a lot of great stories about the people who grew up and contributed to Birmingham, even though they're below the radar. So if you have further questions about our Black history, stop by the museum or give us a call. We'll be happy to talk to you about it. And at this point, I want to thank the Baldwin Public Library and let you know that this presentation will be available as a video recording very soon. We have a number of video recordings at our YouTube channel with the Birmingham Museum, and so does the Baldwin Library. So these free library presentations take place from our group every month, but there are many others, and we encourage you to take advantage of these excellent opportunities to learn more about Birmingham. Thank you.